On the morning of May 27th, 2026, 4 days before the official open of the Atlantic hurricane season, the deepest pool of tropical moisture to lift out of the Caribbean this year is moving north, and it is moving across a country that has just lived through the driest January through March in 131 years. The atmosphere has, for the first time in 181 days, delivered the cure, but the body of moisture delivering that cure is the same body of moisture that the European Centre, the US Operational Ensemble and Google DeepMind are watching for tropical development in the first 10 days of June. The cure and the threat are the same air mass. The country does not get to choose. So if the rain breaking the worst drought in modern record is arriving on the same air mass that might become the hurricane season's first named storm, what happens when the relief and the threat arrive in the same week? And what does that say about the season that opens in 4 days? If you want the version of this story that is grounded in the actual ensembles and the actual data rather than the social media hype, subscribe to the Sky Lab. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and how much rain your county has actually seen in the last 48 hours. I'm reading every one. Hit the like button if you want more pattern recognition videos like this one. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The first drought relief of 2026. At 9:32 on the morning of May 27, 2026, a weather station at Port Isabel Airport on the southern tip of Texas registered a wind gust of 61 miles per hour. The number itself is not extraordinary. Strong thunderstorms in late May along the western Gulf Coast can do worse than 61 miles per hour any year you pick. What matters is what the gust represents. That gust was the leading edge of the deepest pool of tropical moisture to lift out of the Caribbean this year. It was the front door of a body of air that had been sitting over the western Caribbean for days, soaking up water from a sea surface that has been running anomalously warm, and which a digging upper-level trough had finally reached down and grabbed and started lifting north. By the time the gust hit Port Isabel, the National Weather Service office in Brownsville was issuing a severe thunderstorm warning for radar-indicated 70-mile-per-hour winds over southeastern Cameron County. By mid-morning, that same warning had been reissued for a second cell over the port of Brownsville. By late morning, a flash flood warning was active in Dallas, Kaufman, and Rockwall counties in Texas. Another one was active in Fairfield, Franklin, and Licking counties in central Ohio, where 2 to 3.5 inches of rain had already fallen and more was coming. A third was active across the spine of West Virginia. The total National Weather Service alert footprint for the contiguous 48 states stood at 363 active alerts as of mid-morning Eastern Time. 241 were small craft advisories, dominated by Alaska and the Pacific Marine zones. 26 were flood warnings on rivers and creeks that had already breached or were forecast to breach within hours. 11 were flood watches, 6 were red flag warnings, 4 were flash flood warnings, all immediate or imminent. The picture, if you took the time to look at it, was of a country being hit on 3 different faces at the same time. The southern face was being hit by tropical moisture. The eastern face was being hit by an old stalled boundary that hadn't moved in days. The far western face was being hit by an upper-level low that the Los Angeles office of the National Weather Service described, in the most matter-of-fact bureaucratic language imaginable, as unusual for this time of year. Now, none of that is the story. That is what the story looks like from the outside, on a satellite loop, with a coffee in your hand. The story is what's actually being delivered. And what's actually being delivered, for the first time in 5 months, is rain. You and I have been on this drought together. 2 weeks ago, in our video on the worst drought in US history, we walked through the numbers. 62.42% of the contiguous 48 states in drought, 52.15% of the US and Puerto Rico, 158.2 million people across 46 states sitting in conditions of D1 or worse. We walked through the January through March 2026 precipitation deficit and how it was the driest such window in the 131-year statistical record dating back to 1895, which means it beat a record that had stood since 1910. We walked through the March 2026 Palmer Drought Severity Index reading, the highest March on record and the third driest single month of any season ever recorded, behind only July and August of 1934. Those 2 months, July and August 1934, are the climatological peak of the Dust Bowl. So when you read the words third driest month of any season on record, What you're reading is behind only the worst 2 months of the worst drought event in the modern history of the country. That is where we have been living since January, and then yesterday in our video on America's water system running out, we walked through the structural part of it. The Bureau of Reclamation's May 15, 2026 24-month study, projecting Lake Powell, crossing the elevation at which Glen Canyon Dam can reliably generate electricity as early as December. The expiration of the 2007 interim guidelines that have governed the lower Colorado for the past 18 years, occurring on December 31st, with no replacement signed. Phoenix on Stage 2 drought response. Georgia on statewide drought response level 1. The Ogallala Aquifer underneath the Texas Panhandle on a multi-decade timeline toward unusability. We named the dominoes, we named the calendar, and we left that video on an open loop. What does failure mode actually look like when the dominoes start to fall? This is what it looks like first. Before the legal failure, before the hydropower failure, before the agricultural failure compounds another year, before the negotiation failure becomes a federal action, before any of that, the atmosphere finally moves. The drought breaks. Or more precisely, the drought begins to break. The first meaningful tropical moisture surge of 2026 is arriving on the day this video drops, and it will continue arriving across the North Gulf Coast, Florida, the Southeast, and the Ohio Valley through the official open of hurricane season on the 1st of June. For Cancun, for Western Cuba, for the Cayman Islands, for Jamaica, for the entire run of the North Gulf Coast from Brownsville through Mobile and Pensacola, for the state of Florida in its entirety, for Georgia, for Alabama, for Mississippi, for Louisiana, for parts of South Carolina and the Carolinas hinterland, the rain is coming. For the first time in the calendar year, the rain is coming. I want to be careful here, because I want to keep your trust. This rain does not end the drought. I'm not telling you that, in 2 weeks, the US Drought Monitor map is going to be clean. A drought of the depth and duration this one has reached requires months of above-normal precipitation to recover. The hydrologic system does not catch up in 72 hours. Reservoirs do not refill on one storm cycle. Soil moisture does not return to climatology because the sky finally opens. What this rain does is begin the recovery. It begins it at the moment the drought was about to enter its 6th month of structural deepening. It begins it ahead of the climatological peak of fire season. It begins it before the agricultural calendar locks in the worst case for winter wheat and the cattle herd. The drought has not ended. The drought has begun to end. And that, after 181 days of the driest January through March in 131 years, is the news. Now, the mechanism. I am going to give you the meteorological setup in plain English, because the meteorological setup matters for the rest of the video. Sitting over the western United States right now is a deep upper-level trough, a southward dip in the jet stream, the kind that you see on a 500 millibar height map as a steep U-shaped channel of low heights. That trough has been digging south through the Great Basin and into the Bay of Campeche, which is the bowl-shaped southwestern arm of the Gulf of Mexico tucked under the bend of Mexico's coastline. The jet stream, the river of fast-moving air at roughly 30,000 feet, has been dipping into that trough and reaching down into the western Caribbean, lifting tropical moisture northward. Sitting opposite that trough, parked over the southwest Atlantic, is the Bermuda High, the semi-permanent subtropical high-pressure system that, in the late spring and early summer, anchors itself east of the southeastern US and starts pumping warm, humid air northward up its western flank. The combination of those two features, the trough pulling, the Bermuda High pushing, is the engine. The 12 UTC, sounding from Sterling, Virginia, this morning measured a precipitable water value of 1.82 inches. Precipitable water, if you haven't heard the term, is the depth of liquid water you would get if you condensed all the water vapor in the atmospheric column directly above you down to the surface. 1.82 inches is the kind of value you might expect in late July in a humid southeastern air mass, not on the 27th of May over the mid-Atlantic. The National Weather Service office in Miami pulled the latest GFS total precipitable water, normalized anomaly for the same morning, and described it verbatim as around 3 standard deviations above seasonal means, with model precipitable water values exceeding 2 inches. 3 standard deviations above the mean in a normally distributed climatology corresponds to roughly the 0.3% statistical floor. That means 3 out of every 1,000 May 27ths in the modern record. The atmosphere is currently carrying tropical summer moisture in pre-summer conditions, 4 days before the official start of the Atlantic hurricane season. The Weather Prediction Center, which is the National Weather Service's national center for forecasting heavy precipitation, has issued a slight risk of excessive rainfall, level 2 on a 4-level scale, covering the Gulf Coast from eastern Texas through southern Mississippi and far southwest Alabama. That outlook flags the potential for scattered instances of flash flooding. Saturated soils from the past few days of rain are listed in the outlook text as a primary concern. The center has issued a second slight risk covering portions of the Ohio Valley and the Central Appalachians on the same logic: prior rainfall, increasingly saturated soils, flash flood threat at any point where today's storms cluster. The Houston office, in its morning area forecast discussion, described a slow-moving line of strong to severe thunderstorms already moving across southeast Texas, with forecast rainfall totals of 1 to 2 inches and localized pockets up to 5 inches over the day. The Brownsville office is already in the warning phase. The Wilmington, Ohio office is already in the warning phase. The Charleston, West Virginia office is in the warning phase. By tonight, when the broadcast meteorologists do their evening weather hits, the country is going to be looking at a continuous corridor of heavy precipitation from South Texas through central Mississippi up into the Tennessee Valley and the Ohio Valley. This is what the drought break starts as: not a gentle rain on a calm day, not a soft landing. The first real precipitation event into a drought-primed continent is going to be hard, because the drought-primed continent does not absorb water the way a normally hydrated continent does. We are going to come back to that in part 2. But what I want you to hold on to as we move forward into the rest of this video is the first piece of the story. The story is not the drought. The story is not the storm. The story is the air mass. This specific body of moisture that is lifting out of the Western Caribbean today, and through the next 4 days, that will lay rain across the parched southeast and the parched Gulf Coast, that is being watched by every major weather model in the world for what it does at the moment hurricane season officially opens. That air mass is the protagonist of this video. Everything else in the next 19,000 words is about what that air mass does next. Because what that air mass is doing right now is delivering the cure, and what that air mass might be doing 4 days from now is something else entirely. Part 2. What the atmosphere is actually carrying. 3 standard deviations above the seasonal mean. Let me sit with that number with you for a minute, because I think the meteorologists who write the morning AFDs sometimes drop a phrase that should make the average viewer stop and put down their coffee, and the phrase passes by because nobody outside the meteorological community translates what it actually means. A normally distributed data set, and atmospheric variables like precipitable water are pretty close to normally distributed if you look at the right baseline, has roughly 68% of its values within 1 standard deviation of the mean, about 95% of its values within 2 standard deviations, about 99.7% within 3 standard deviations. Anything beyond 3 standard deviations is in the bottom 0.3% of 1% of the historical distribution. In plain language, what the Miami office reported this morning is that what's loaded over Florida and the Gulf right now is, statistically speaking, something that happens about 3 times out of every 1,000 May 27ths in the modern record. 3 out of 1,000. Pick a May 27th at random going back 45 years, and you would expect to find this much moisture in the air over the Gulf and Florida in maybe one of them, maybe 2. Today is one of those days. And that matters not because the number is impressive on a graph. It matters because of what the number physically corresponds to. 2 inches of precipitable water means that the atmospheric column over you, from the surface to the top of the troposphere, is holding the equivalent of 2 inches of liquid water in vapor form. If something, a front, a sea breeze, a convective updraft, a mesoscale convective system, squeezes that column dry, you get up to 2 inches of rain on the ground. In practice, the squeeze is never complete, and the precipitation efficiency varies, but in a tropical air mass with the right lifting mechanism, 3/4 to 90% precipitation efficiency is achievable. So when the morning AFDs across the southern tier are warning about rainfall totals of 2, 3, 4, and locally 5 inches per cell, those numbers are not pulled out of thin air. They are coming directly out of the precipitable water budget. The atmosphere is carrying the rain. The only question is how the surface receives it, and the surface, in much of the southeastern Gulf Coast and Mid-South, is going to receive it badly. I want to be honest about that because the temptation is to treat drought-breaking rain as pure good news, and it's not. It's necessary news. It's overdue news. But the first real precipitation event into a continent that has been baking in drought for 181 days is going to do things that the same rain on a normally hydrated land surface would not do. The mechanism is well characterized in the climate science literature. There's a paper, Morales et al., published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2019 that quantifies the soil-moisture-atmosphere coupling for extreme weather events. The core finding is that dry soils amplify the local atmospheric response in ways that wet soils don't. Most of the time, when people cite that paper, they cite the heat side of it. Dry soils don't have water to evaporate, so they can't cool themselves through latent heat flux. So the boundary layer heats up faster and reaches higher peak temperatures than it would over wet soil. That mechanism is part of why drought-stricken regions also tend to break heat records, and we've used that framing on this channel in prior videos, but the same mechanism cuts the other way. A soil that has been dry for 181 days has lost its capacity to absorb water at normal rates. The pore structure of the upper soil column has compacted. Hydrophobic crusts have formed on the surface in many drought-prone areas. That's a real soil science phenomenon called surface sealing or crusting, and it is well documented in agricultural studies from the Great Plains, the Southeast and the Mediterranean. When the first major precipitation event hits that compacted, crusted surface, the infiltration rate is dramatically reduced. The water doesn't go into the soil, it runs across the surface, into the nearest low spot, into the nearest stream, into the nearest river. The runoff coefficient, the fraction of total precipitation that becomes surface runoff rather than infiltration, can be 2 or 3 times higher on a drought-primed land surface than on a normally hydrated one. What that means in practical terms is that the same 1 to 3 inches of rain that would produce moderate localized flooding on a normal Gulf Coast day in late May 2026 is going to produce disproportionate, faster rising flash flooding on a much shorter timeline. And that is what we're seeing right now in real time in the river gauge data. The river flood warnings that are active across the southern tier this morning are not gentle, multi-day rises. The Oso Creek near Corpus Christi is forecast to rise to 23.9 feet late this morning, fall to 12.9 feet by evening, and rise again on Friday. That's a flash response, not a slow flood. The Wolf River above Gulfport, Mississippi is in moderate flooding, with water moving onto residential property at 12 feet. The Pearl River along the Louisiana-Mississippi border is in minor flooding and rising. The Jordan River near Kiln and Bay St. Louis is in minor flooding. The East Hobolachito Creek near Caesar, Mississippi is in minor flooding. The South Fork Sabine near Quinlan, Texas is forecast to enter minor flooding by evening. The Saluda River at Chappelle, South Carolina is in minor flooding. The Calcasieu near White Oak Park, Louisiana is in minor flooding. The Aransas near Skidmore, Texas is forecast to enter minor flooding this evening. The South Fork Licking near Buckeye Lake, Ohio is in minor flooding. Now here's the editorial layer the broadcast meteorologists are not going to give you, and I think it matters. The drought baseline that this rain is hitting is not uniform across the southeast. The numbers from the US Drought Monitor on May 19th and 20th are stark. 99% of the southeast region in drought, 62% of the southeast in D3, extreme, or D4, exceptional. Those are the 2 worst categories on the Drought Monitor's 5-step scale. Arkansas at 99.5% in drought, Mississippi at 93%, Louisiana at 77%, Georgia at 96% as of March 31st, before the state went on drought response level 1 on April 27th. Florida sitting under what the Miami office described in the morning's AFD as a transition to a significantly more wet weather pattern, beginning tonight and lasting through the weekend, or even into early next week. The agricultural sector is going to feel this rain in 2 directions at once. The benefit side, row crops in the parched southeast that have been struggling to germinate and emerge, are about to get the soaking they needed. Pastures and rangeland under cattle production. And remember, the USDA Crop Progress Report has 61% of US cattle production areas in drought, up from 31% year over year, are about to start greening up. The Georgia and South Carolina growing region is about to start rewatering. That is unambiguously good news. The damage side, Winter wheat in the southern plains and mid-south that's already on the harvest clock may take quality hits from late-stage rain. The good to excellent rating on US winter wheat is already at 30%, the lowest on record, and the 2026 wheat acreage is the lowest since 1919. A late-season precipitation event on top of mature wheat can degrade test weight and protein. Some of the rain is going to land on parched fields and save them. Some of the rain is going to land on harvest-ready fields and degrade the crop. The net effect is probably positive. The drought break is more valuable than the harvest noise. But I want you to understand that the rain is not pure good news, even for the people who need it most. And then there's the wildfire side. The US Drought Monitor map and the US Fire Weather map have been the same map for 181 days. 1.7 million acres burned through mid to late April 2026, twice the 10-year pace for that calendar window. Nebraska's Morill Fire, 640,000 acres, the largest single fire in state history. The drought-primed continent has been a tinderbox. The arriving moisture surge is going to drop the live fuel moisture content across the southeastern Gulf Coast, raising the live fuel moisture toward the 80 to 100% normal range that suppresses ignition. That's also unambiguously good news. The fire weather forecast across the western half of the country, and we will come back to this in Part 7, does not change. The western fire weather setup is sitting under a different part of the same upper-level configuration, but the southeastern fire risk, which has been building all spring on the back of the same 131-year precipitation deficit, is going to recede with the rain. That's real. Now, I want to spend a minute on what saturated soils means in the official Weather Prediction Center forecasting language, because the phrase comes up over and over in the morning area forecast discussions, and I think most viewers gloss past it without realizing it's a specific operational term with specific physical consequences. When a National Weather Service office writes, saturated soils from previous rainfall will elevate the concern, that's the Wilmington, Ohio office from this morning, what they're saying is that the upper soil column in their forecast area has filled to its field capacity from a previous precipitation event. The pore spaces between soil particles are largely occupied by water, and any additional incoming precipitation has nowhere to infiltrate to accept the next layer down or, more commonly, across the surface as runoff. A saturated soil behaves hydrologically like a paved surface. The runoff coefficient approaches 1, meaning that nearly all the precipitation that lands on it becomes immediate runoff into the local drainage network. The drought-baked soils across the Gulf Coast and the southeast have not had a soaking event in months. The Ohio Valley soils, by contrast, have had repeated precipitation events over the past 2 weeks and are sitting closer to field capacity. The same atmospheric river of moisture is going to hit two fundamentally different surface hydrology states, and the flash flood response is going to vary by region accordingly. In the Ohio Valley, the response is going to be a rapid rise on saturated antecedent conditions. The kind of response that produces the flash flood warnings we're seeing in Fairfield, Franklin, and Licking counties this morning, where 2 to 3.5 inches have already fallen on already wet ground. In the Deep South, the response is going to be a rapid rise on hydrophobic crusted antecedent conditions, the kind of response where the rain hits the surface and runs sideways before it can begin to soak in. Both of those response modes produce flash flooding. They produce it through different physical mechanisms, and the Weather Prediction Center has flagged both of them in this morning's outlook. The other piece of the surface hydrology story is what happens after the rain stops. A normally hydrated soil, after a precipitation event, slowly drains downward through gravity, recharging the shallow groundwater system over the following days and weeks. A drought-baked soil, even after it receives several inches of precipitation, may not effectively recharge the groundwater system if the precipitation runs off rather than infiltrates. The shallow water table recovery that the Southeast desperately needs, for well users in rural counties, for shallow surface water systems, for the smaller agricultural reservoirs, depends on infiltration, not on runoff. The flood stage rises on the major rivers, the dramatic photographs of swollen creeks, the flash flood warnings on a county-by-county basis. Those are the visible parts of the precipitation event. The hidden part, the part that determines whether the drought relief is durable or transient, is whether the water actually makes it into the ground. And the answer to that question depends on the rate of precipitation, the antecedent soil condition, the slope of the terrain, the ground cover, and a half dozen other variables that vary by sub-region. the southeast is going to receive a heterogeneous response. Some of the rain is going to do exactly what the drought maps need it to do. Some of the rain is going to wash off and produce flood without recharge, which is going to be visible only in the US drought monitor updates over the next 4 to 6 weeks, not in the immediate satellite imagery. So what is the atmosphere actually carrying? It's carrying drought-busting rain for the southeast and the Gulf Coast and the Ohio Valley. It's carrying flash flood risk on drought-primed soils in the same regions. It's carrying agricultural net positive impact with some harvest-side noise. It's carrying fire weather relief for the southeast and a continued fire weather threat in the west. And underneath all of that, it is carrying, sitting in the lower troposphere over the Western Caribbean, where the trough is doing the lifting, and the Bermuda High is providing the eastern boundary, and the sea surface is providing the heat reservoir. It is carrying the conditions that produce tropical cyclogenesis, which is where we go next. Because the same body of moisture that is breaking the drought, when you follow it back to its source, is sitting on top of an ocean basin that is 4 days from the official open of hurricane season. And the rest of the world's weather models are looking at that body of moisture and asking a different question than, will it rain in Tallahassee on Saturday? They're asking whether the body of moisture itself organises into something with a name. We are going to get to that in part 3. But before we leave the cure side of the story and start moving toward the threat side, I want you to hold this one thought. The rain we're about to receive is the rain that comes from the same conditions that produce hurricanes. The two are not separate events. They are two outcomes of the same setup. Part 3. The same air mass. Two outcomes. Here is the thread of this video. Every part from here forward circles back to it. The air mass that is breaking the worst drought in modern record is the same air mass that the world's major weather models are watching for tropical development. The drought relief and the season's first storm are not separate stories about different atmospheric setups. They are two outcomes of the same upper-level configuration. The cure rides on the same air, the threat rides on the same air. The country does not get to receive one of them without receiving the other. That is the entire video in 2 sentences. I want to walk you through why that's true mechanistically, because the claim is editorial and it matters and it should not be taken on faith. The deep upper trough that's been digging into the Bay of Campeche for the past 48 hours is doing 2 simultaneous jobs. The first job, the one we just talked about in parts 1 and 2, is to lift tropical moisture out of the Western Caribbean and pump it northward across the Gulf Coast and into the southeast. That's the drought relief side. The second job, the one we haven't gotten to yet, is to provide the upper-level dynamical support that early-season tropical cyclones need in order to organise. A closed surface low needs upper-level divergence above it, air moving away from the centre at altitude, to ventilate the system, to allow the surface circulation to deepen, to allow convection to consolidate into organised bands rather than dissipating. The trough that's lifting our moisture northward is the same feature that, on its eastern flank, is producing the upper-level divergence pattern that any closed surface circulation forming under it would feed on. The trough is not finishing its work when it drops rain on Pensacola. The trough is also a cyclogenesis-enabling feature for the Western Caribbean, if a surface low manages to organise underneath it. The Bermuda High is the other half of the engine. Right now, that high is parked over the southwest Atlantic, pumping warm, humid air northward up its western flank. That's how the moisture from the Caribbean gets dragged across Cuba and the Gulf and up into Florida and Georgia. But the Bermuda High also determines the steering of any tropical system that does form. If the high is positioned where it currently is, a tropical system organising in the Western Caribbean or the Bay of Campeche over the next 1 to 2 weeks would be steered northward into the Gulf, not eastward toward the Atlantic. The configuration that is making the drought break possible is the configuration that, if a storm forms, drives the storm into the Gulf Coast, into the same drought-broken landscape that is, by then, partially recovered from 181 days of dry. That's the geometric reality of what's happening over the next 2 weeks. The trough that brings the rain is the trough that gives a storm a place to organise. The high that lifts the moisture is the high that steers a storm into the Gulf. Drought relief and tropical cyclogenesis are not separate scenarios. They are the same scenario, separated only by whether one closed surface low manages to consolidate inside the moisture envelope that the trough and the high are already painting on the map. And that brings us to the question every weather model in the world is being asked right now. Not will there be rain on the Gulf Coast. That's already answered. The rain is here. The question is, at some point between June 1st and June 10th, will a closed surface low manage to consolidate inside this moisture envelope? There's a meteorological term for the calendar window we're entering. It's called early season tropical shenanigans. That's a term of art the broadcast meteorology community uses for the period from late May through the first 10 days of June, when the conditions favourable to tropical development in the Caribbean and Gulf are present, but the climatological probability is still low. About a third of all Atlantic hurricane seasons produce a named storm before June 15th. About 1 in 8 produces a named storm before June 1st. Of the named storms that do form in late May, or the first half of June, the overwhelming majority form in one of 3 geographies: the Western Caribbean Sea, the Bay of Campeche, and the Eastern Gulf of Mexico. They form there because those 3 locations consistently combine warm sea surface temperatures with the kind of upper-level divergence that early season troughs provide. They form there because the Madden-Julian Oscillation, the largest single source of intraseasonal variability in the tropics, often has its convectively active phase parked over the Western Hemisphere during late May and early June. They form there because the climatological vertical wind shear minimum sits over the Caribbean in the late spring, before the Bermuda High strengthens and the upper-level subtropical jet retreats poleward. All 3 of those conditions are present right now. The Western Caribbean and Bay of Campeche sea surface temperatures are running warm. The Madden-Julian Oscillation is forecast to be in phases 1, 2, or 8. Its Western Hemisphere convectively active phases through the entire June 1st through 10th window. Atlantic vertical wind shear is forecast to weaken, and the trough we just discussed is providing upper-level divergence right where any surface low would need it. That is what the ensembles are looking at. They are not making things up. They are looking at the convergence of every variable that contributes to tropical cyclogenesis, all of them aligning at the same time, in the same place, on the same calendar window. And the ensembles are responding the way they should respond, by showing non-zero probability of development in the same window. We will get to the specific ensemble numbers in Part 5, after we walk through the social media noise in Part 4. But I want to plant the flag here, before we get to the noise, because the noise is going to be loud, and I want you to remember what's actually true while you're hearing the loud version. What's actually true is this: the drought is breaking, the atmosphere is delivering the relief. The conditions that allow the atmosphere to deliver the relief are the conditions that would allow a tropical storm to form. And the official open of hurricane season is 4 days from this video's published date. That convergence, 4 days, 3 independent ensemble systems, the same calendar window, the same air mass, is what makes this video necessary. The hype channels are wrong about Arthur forming today. They are also missing the actual signal, which is that the legitimate forecast is for possible development inside the same air mass that's breaking the drought in the window that opens 4 days from now. The hype channel ecosystem is wrong twice, once about the timing and once about what the signal even means. We're going to spend Part 4 on the first error and Part 5 on the second. But the foundation is set. The thread is set. Every part of this video from this point forward serves one sentence. The cure and the threat are the same air mass. If you take nothing else away from the next 16,000 words, take that one sentence. The rain on your roof in Tallahassee on Saturday and the named storm that might form in the Western Caribbean on Wednesday are not 2 different stories. They are 2 outcomes of the same atmospheric configuration, and the country does not get to receive the cure without also receiving the threat. Now, let's talk about what every other channel on the internet is getting wrong about that. Part 4. The storm that isn't forming. If you spent any time on a weather-focused feed in the last 48 hours, you have seen the thumbnails, a swirling mass of red and orange over the Caribbean, the word Arthur in 50-point type, some variation of developing fast or forming now or imminent or this is much worse. The implication of all of it is that the first named storm of the 2026 Atlantic hurricane season is about to form, that it is already forming, that it has effectively already formed and the meteorological community is just waiting to slap a name on it. The implication of all of it is that you need to be afraid of the storm by the end of the week. I want to give you the official position of the National Hurricane Center verbatim before I say anything else. Here is the exact text of the Atlantic Tropical Weather Outlook, issued at 8 in the morning Eastern Daylight Time on May 27th, 2026 by forecaster Berg, the on-shift forecaster at the National Hurricane Center in Miami. Quote, "For the North Atlantic, Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of America, tropical cyclone formation is not expected during the next 7 days." Close quote. That's the entire outlook. No invest area, no designated area of interest, no yellow circle on the map, no orange circle, no red circle, 0. Through next Tuesday. The Eastern Pacific Tropical Weather Outlook, issued the same morning by forecaster Reinhardt in the same office, says the same thing. Tropical cyclone formation not expected during the next 7 days, 0. Through next Tuesday. So why is your social media feed full of Arthur thumbnails? Let me walk you through what's actually different between the imagery the hype channels are using and the meteorological criteria for a tropical storm. Because if you understand the difference, the hype thumbnails stop working on you, and the next time you see one, and you will see them, probably every day for the next week and a half, you'll be able to look at it and know whether it's signal or noise without having to wait for somebody to tell you. A tropical storm is a meteorological entity with 4 specific properties. 1. A closed surface circulation. That means there is an identifiable low-pressure center at the surface, and the wind around that center is rotating in a closed loop. Not a chevron, not a comma, not a band of thunderstorms moving from west to east. A closed rotation. You can identify it on surface observations from buoys and ships. You can identify it on satellite imagery from the curvature of low-level clouds. You can identify it on scatterometer data from satellite-borne instruments that measure surface wind direction and speed. If there is no closed surface circulation, there is no tropical cyclone. Full stop. 2. A warm core thermal structure. Tropical cyclones are warm in the middle. The air at the center of a tropical cyclone, at the altitudes where the system is organized, is warmer than the air at the same altitude outside the system. This is what differentiates a tropical system from an extratropical low. Extratropical lows have cold cores. The warm core is detectable on satellite-derived temperature soundings, on aircraft reconnaissance data when reconnaissance is flown, and on the system's response to environmental winds. Without a warm core, there is no tropical cyclone. The thing on your screen might be a low-pressure system. It might be an organized mesoscale convective vortex. It might be a tropical disturbance. It is not a tropical storm. 3. Organized convective banding around the low center. Tropical cyclones develop characteristic spiral bands of deep convection that rotate around the center. The bands have visible structure on satellite imagery. They are not just a blob of thunderstorms moving in a general direction. They are organized features with identifiable inflow regions, identifiable outflow regions, and a developing eyewall structure at the center of the system. A pile of thunderstorms with no organization is not a tropical cyclone. 4. An active invest area designation from the National Hurricane Center. The NHC uses a numerical designation system, Invest 9L, Invest 90L, etc., for areas of interest that meteorologists are actively tracking, with the possibility of designation as a named storm. When the NHC promotes a disturbance to invest status, they generate dedicated numerical model runs for it. They issue more frequent updates on it. They begin coordinating with the Air Force Reserve hurricane hunters for potential reconnaissance flights. As of the morning of May 27th, there are 0 invest areas in the Atlantic Basin. There are 0 invest areas in the Eastern Pacific Basin. There are 0 invest areas in the Caribbean Sea or the Gulf of Mexico. There is no system being officially tracked for development. Now let's look at what the hype thumbnails are actually showing. The imagery they're using is a satellite loop of the deep tropical moisture surge we talked about in parts 1 through 3, the very moisture body that is breaking the drought. On a visible spectrum satellite loop, that moisture body looks dramatic. It's the deepest pool of moisture to lift out of the Caribbean this year. It produces tall convective towers as it rises through the boundary layer. It generates lightning. It produces heavy rain. It looks, to an untrained eye, like a tropical system might look. The hype channels have figured out that if you take that imagery and slap Arthur on top of it in red letters with an arrow, the average viewer cannot tell the difference between a closed circulation and a moisture surge. So they slap the letters on. They get the click, they get the watch time, they get the ad revenue. There is no closed surface circulation in that imagery. There is no warm core thermal structure in that imagery. There is no organized convective banding in that imagery. Just a band of thunderstorms moving with the upper level flow. There is no invest area associated with it. The hype channels are showing you a moisture surge and calling it a storm. I want to say something about the economics of this because I think it's worth saying once plainly and then we move on. The hype channel business model is built on the gap between what looks scary on a satellite image and what is actually scary in meteorological reality. The gap is wide. The video that gets the click is the video that exploits the gap. The viewer cost is not the click itself, it's the loss of trust. After enough false alarms, viewers either stop trusting all weather coverage, or they get desensitized to legitimate warnings, or they get permanently anxious about events that don't happen. None of those outcomes is good for the people who actually depend on accurate weather information when something genuine does form. The hype is not free. The hype has a downstream cost, and the cost is paid by people who live on the Gulf Coast and need accurate hurricane information when the actual storm shows up. That is the position of this channel. We're going to keep being the channel that tells you when the science is the story and when the noise is the story. Today, the noise is the story, because the noise is loud enough to obscure the actual signal that the real ensembles are sending, and the actual signal is interesting. The actual signal is what we are about to spend part 5 on. Because here's the thing the hype channels are missing. While they are wrong about Arthur forming today, they are also missing the part of the forecast that's actually worth talking about. The legitimate signal, the signal that the European Centre for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts, the US Operational Ensemble, and Google DeepMind's AI weather model are all picking up, is for possible development in the same air mass we have been following in the window from the 1st to the 10th of June. That's not now. That's next week into the week after. And the signal is real. And it is coming from 3 independent modelling systems with different physics and different architectures. And it is one of the more interesting tropical development signals to land in late May in recent years. The hype channels are wrong twice. Once about the timing, they're saying today, the signal says next week. And once about the meaning, they're treating it as a guaranteed Arthur, when the legitimate signal is for possible development in a window, not a certain storm in a moment. The viewer who watches their content gets the wrong forecast in 2 directions at once. The viewer who watches this channel gets hopefully the right one. Let's go look at it. Part 5. What the ensembles are actually saying. There are 3 major weather modelling systems whose ensembles are worth taking seriously when you are looking at a possible tropical development window. The first is the operational ensemble produced by the European Centre for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts in Reading, England. The second is the operational ensemble produced by the US National Centers for Environmental Prediction in College Park, Maryland, the GEFS, the Global Ensemble Forecast System. The third, which is a newer addition to the operational landscape, is the ensemble produced by Google DeepMind, the AI weather modelling group at Google, using their GenCast and GraphCast systems. Each of these 3 systems uses different underlying physics, different resolutions, different data assimilation methods, and different ensemble generation philosophies. They are about as independent as 3 modern operational ensembles get. When they disagree, you have meaningful uncertainty. When they agree, even on a low probability signal, the agreement itself is the signal. They are agreeing, in their May 27th runs, on a low probability signal for possible tropical development in the Western Caribbean or Northeastern Gulf of Mexico between June 1st and June 10th. Let me walk you through each one. The European Centre's operational ensemble runs 51 members each cycle. Each member is initialized with slightly different starting conditions to capture the uncertainty in the analysis. As of the latest 12 UTC cycle, approximately 5 to 8 of those 51 members are showing a closed low-pressure system somewhere in the Western Caribbean Sea or the northeastern Gulf of Mexico during the June 1st through June 5th window. That's a probability of development in the range of 10 to 16%. That is not a high confidence forecast. It is a non-zero probability of development at a 10-day lead, which is meaningful. The European Centre Ensemble is generally regarded as the most skillful operational ensemble on the planet for medium-range tropical forecasting. It is the system that consistently outperforms the US and UK ensembles on multi-day track and intensity guidance. When the European ensemble puts 5 to 8 members on a closed low at 10 days out, that is a signal to pay attention. The US operational ensemble, GEFS, runs 31 members. It is showing a higher count of closed low members in the same window. The exact number varies by cycle, but consistently in the range of 8 to 12 members out of 31. That's a probability of development in the range of 25 to 40%. Now here's where you need to apply some skepticism. The GFS, the deterministic GFS, the model whose ensemble is GFS, has a well-documented historical bias toward over-aggression on early-season tropical cyclogenesis. The model tends to spin up closed surface circulations in environments where the European model and the UK model don't, and historically, those closed circulations don't always verify. So the higher GFS ensemble probability is consistent with the European ensemble signal. Both are seeing the same favourable environment, but the GFS number is structurally inflated, and the European centre probability is probably closer to the true odds. Call it 10 to 20%. The third system is the one I want you to pay the most attention to, because it is a newer addition to the operational forecasting landscape, and it significantly outperformed the traditional models on tropical track forecasting during the 2025 Atlantic hurricane season. Google DeepMind's GenCast is a generative AI ensemble that produces 50 members per cycle. The architecture is fundamentally different from the European Centre's spectral model, and the US GFS, GenCast, is a machine learning system trained on the ERA5 reanalysis dataset, learning the underlying physical dynamics of the atmosphere through deep neural networks rather than through hand-coded numerical equations. The system was published in Nature in late 2024. During the 2025 Atlantic hurricane season, it produced track forecasts that, on average, beat the European Centre by 12 to 15% and beat the GFS by 20 to 25% on 5 to 10-day lead times for tropical cyclones. GenCast is showing approximately 3 of its 50 members converging on a closed low signature in the Western Caribbean or Northeastern Gulf during the June 1st through June 5th window. 3 out of 50 is 6% probability. That sounds low. But the value of GenCast in this context is not the absolute probability. It's the fact that an architecture that is fundamentally different from the European and US dynamical models is independently picking up the same signal in the same window. When a numerical model and a machine learning model agree on a low probability tropical development signal, that's a stronger signal than either one alone. So let's add up what we have. 3 independent operational ensembles, European, US, DeepMind. 3 different architectures, spectral numerical model, semi-Lagrangian numerical model, generative AI. 3 different agencies, ECMWF, NCEP, Google. 3 different countries, England, the United States again, but a fundamentally different institution. All 3 are converging on the same low probability signal for development in the same 5-day window. The probability range across the 3 systems is 6% on the conservative end and 40% on the aggressive end, with the most skillful system putting it at 10 to 16%. That is a real, non-trivial signal at 10 days out. And here's the part that the broadcast coverage isn't going to tell you. The reason the ensembles are converging is not that they all happen to be looking at the same noise. The reason they are converging is that they are all picking up the same underlying physical conditions, the Madden-Julian oscillation, which is the largest single source of subseasonal variability in the tropics, a roughly 40 to 60-day eastward propagating envelope of enhanced convection that circles the equator, is forecast to be in its Western Hemisphere active phases 1, 2 and 8 on the standard 8-phase scale, through the entire June 1st through June 10th window. When the MJO is in those phases, the entire Western Hemisphere tropical basin experiences enhanced upper-level divergence, reduced vertical wind shear, and increased low-level convergence. Those 3 things are the synoptic scale prerequisites for tropical cyclogenesis. The ensembles are not predicting development out of nowhere. They are predicting development out of the most favourable subseasonal environment the Atlantic basin will see in the next month. On top of the MJO, the Atlantic vertical wind shear is forecast to weaken across the Western Caribbean and Gulf through the same window. Vertical wind shear, the change in wind direction and speed with height, is the principal enemy of tropical cyclone development. High shear rips developing systems apart before they can organise. Low shear allows the warm core structure to consolidate. The shear forecast for June 1st through 10th is, depending on the model, anywhere from below climatology to well below climatology. That favours development. Sea surface temperatures across the Western Caribbean and Gulf are running warm. The exact numbers vary by week and by sub-region, but the basin is generally 1 to 1.5 degrees Celsius, above the 1981 through 2010 climatological mean for the date. That is sufficient sea surface temperature for tropical development. It is not super warm. We're not in the August through October range where 5-foot waves indicate 29 degrees Celsius water, but it is warm enough for a low-end tropical storm. There's a piece of context here that I think most viewers don't have, and that's worth filling in. The European Centre's ensemble was the system that, during the 2017 Atlantic hurricane season, was already showing closed-low signatures for what would become Hurricane Harvey roughly 9 days before formation, while the US operational system was still on the fence. It was the system that flagged Hurricane Sandy's eventual leftward turn into the New Jersey coastline 4 days before the US operational guidance fully committed to that track. The European model has earned its reputation through decade-long verification studies. The mean absolute error on its Day 5 tropical track forecasts is consistently in the 150 to 200 kilometre range, which is the operational gold standard. So when the European ensemble puts 5 to 8 members on closed lows in the Western Caribbean and Northeastern Gulf for the June 1st through June 5th window, the verification history says that signals should be treated as real, even at 10 days out and even at low, absolute probability. A low probability signal from a high-skill model is meaningfully different from a low probability signal from a low-skill model. We are looking at the former. The GFS, by contrast, has known structural biases that meteorologists adjust for. The model tends to spin up closed circulations in the Western Caribbean in May and June at rates that don't verify. The false alarm rate on early season Jeff cyclogenesis signals has been studied and is on the order of 50%. So when Jeff shows 12 closed-low members for early June, the operational interpretation is to multiply by roughly half the probability. Call the GFS-derived probability 12 to 20%, rather than the raw 25 to 40%. That is consistent with the European probability, which is the more trustworthy number anyway. The convergence I described earlier is the underlying physical signal, not the inflated GFS expression of it. GenCast deserves a more detailed treatment because the architecture is so new and the implications are still being understood by the operational forecasting community. The system was published in the journal Nature in late 2024 by Google DeepMind's Weather Group, with a paper that demonstrated medium-range track and intensity skill on tropical cyclones that exceeded the European Centre's ensemble by 12 to 15%. The system is trained on the ERA5 reanalysis dataset, which is a 45-year record of three-dimensional atmospheric state reconstructed from observations using the European Centre's data assimilation system, and the training learns the underlying physical dynamics of the atmosphere through a generative diffusion process applied to the gridded state. Critically, the system makes no use of the hand-coded physics equations that traditional numerical models like the European model and the GFS rely on. There are no parameterizations for moist convection, no schemes for radiation transfer, no equations for atmospheric boundary layer mixing. The system learns the patterns from observed data and reproduces them in forecast. The fact that an architecture this different from the European and GFS approaches is independently picking up the same June 1st through 10th signal is meaningful. It means that whatever the conditions are in the Western Caribbean and Gulf right now, they are recognizable to multiple fundamentally different ways of looking at the atmosphere. The signal is real because 3 different mathematical systems agree on it. Now, all of that said, I want to be careful about overinterpreting a 10% probability at 10 days out. A 10% probability means a 90% probability of no development. The most likely outcome of the June 1st through 10th window is that nothing organises. The moisture surge passes through, dropping its rain across the southeast, and dissipates without ever becoming a closed circulation. That is the modal outcome. The 10 to 15% probability of development is the tail. It's a fat tail, fatter than you would expect from climatology, because the underlying environmental conditions are favourable. But it's still the tail. What development would actually look like if it occurs is probably a low-end tropical storm. The kind of system that gets named, that runs for 2 or 3 days, that produces drought-busting heavy rain across the Gulf Coast and Florida, that requires no large-scale evacuation but produces local flood warnings, that has the broadcast meteorology community in moderate excitement for 48 hours. Maximum sustained winds of 40 to 60 miles per hour. A central pressure in the high 900s to the low 1000s in millibars. A track that takes it somewhere from the eastern Yucatan northeastward into the eastern Gulf or central Gulf, possibly into Florida, or possibly recurving through the western Caribbean back into the Atlantic. The probability of a major hurricane forming in this window is essentially zero. The probability of a Category 1 or 2 impacting the US Gulf Coast is probably under 5%. The most likely outcome of a successful cyclogenesis is a tropical storm that the broadcast meteorologists in Tampa and Pensacola will run on the front of their newscasts for 4 nights, that will deliver beneficial rain to a parched Florida and South Georgia, and that will dissipate before anyone remembers its name. If it forms, it will probably be called Arthur, the actual Arthur, not the fake Arthur the hype channels have been selling since Monday, but the storm itself is not the story. The story is what season this is the first storm of, and to understand that, we need to talk about what's happening in the equatorial Pacific Ocean 4,000 miles away, on a different ocean basin, on a different timeline, and on a different mechanism, but feeding into the same Atlantic hurricane season we are about to enter. Part 6. The ENSO Handoff. Pull up the data on the Oceanic Niño Index for the past 6 seasons. The Oceanic Niño Index is the 3-month running average of sea surface temperature anomalies in the Niño 3.4 region of the equatorial Pacific Ocean, the central Pacific between 5 degrees north and 5 degrees south, between 170 degrees west and 120 degrees west. It's the standard metric used by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Climate Prediction Center to classify the state of the El Niño Southern Oscillation. When the Oceanic Niño Index is at minus 0.5 degrees Celsius or colder for 5 consecutive overlapping 3-month seasons, we're in La Niña. When the index is at plus 0.5 degrees Celsius or warmer for 5 consecutive overlapping seasons, we're in El Niño. Anything in between is neutral. Here are the values, season by season, going back into the recent past. September, October, November 2025, minus 0.51. La Niña, October, November, December 2025, minus 0.55. La Niña, November, December, January 2025 into 2026, minus 0.54. La Niña, December to January to February 2026, minus 0.37. Neutral but cold side neutral. January to February, March 2026, minus 0.15. Neutral, much closer to the middle. February, March, April 2026, plus 0.11. Neutral, but now on the warm side. That is a swing of plus 0.66 degrees Celsius in 3 overlapping seasons. The trend is explicitly labelled in the NOAA data as warming. Sea surface temperatures in the Niño 3.4 region rose from 25.97 degrees Celsius in November, December to January to 27.28 degrees Celsius in February, March to April. The atmospheric machinery that responds to the equatorial Pacific sea surface temperature is starting to feel that warming. The Climate Prediction Center has the El Niño Watch in effect. The 5-day update from the previous source doc cycle put El Niño onset probability at 82 to 98% during the May, June, July window. That's now, basically, with 96% persistence into the December, January, February 2026 into 2027 winter, and roughly 1 in 3 probability of reaching strong or very strong intensity, plus 1.5 or plus 2.0 degrees Celsius, by the December-January-February peak. The physical reservoir for the basin-scale warming is in the subsurface. In our video from a few days ago on the heat wave forming in the Pacific, we walked through the subsurface Kelvin wave that's been propagating eastward across the equatorial Pacific for the past several months, with anomalies of plus 6 to 7 degrees Celsius at 100-meter depth. That subsurface heat reservoir is the inertia behind the warming surface anomaly. The surface will continue to warm as the subsurface continues to upwell, and the upwelling will continue as the trade winds stay relaxed. So what does this matter for the Atlantic hurricane season? The relationship between El Niño and Atlantic hurricane activity is one of the most robust large-scale teleconnections in tropical meteorology. When El Niño is active, the warmer central Pacific produces enhanced convection in the central equatorial Pacific, which strengthens the Walker Circulation's upward branch over the Pacific and intensifies the subsidence branch over the tropical Atlantic. The result is increased vertical wind shear across the Atlantic basin, specifically stronger upper-level westerlies and weaker lower-level easterlies, which produce the kind of shear environment that suppresses tropical cyclone development. The Atlantic basin tends to be quieter during El Niño years, especially during the peak August-September-October window, when most of the season's storms form. But the relationship is not absolute, and it is not instantaneous. El Niño suppresses Atlantic activity by August through October most reliably. During May, June, and the first half of July, the early season window, the El Niño suppression has not yet fully developed. The atmosphere takes time to respond to the equatorial Pacific. The sheer environment in the early season can still be favourable for tropical development even as the equatorial Pacific is warming, and in years where the Atlantic basin starts with anomalously warm sea surface temperatures of its own, the early season can be quite active even with El Niño conditions developing, because the local Caribbean and Gulf conditions are favourable and the basin-wide suppression hasn't kicked in yet. That is the situation right now. The Atlantic basin has anomalously warm sea surface temperatures across the Caribbean and Gulf. The MJO is in a favourable phase. The vertical wind shear is forecast to weaken in the June 1st through June 10th window. The equatorial Pacific is warming but has not yet reached the threshold where El Niño-driven shear suppression kicks in across the Atlantic. The window for early season tropical activity in the Western Caribbean and Gulf is wide open. There are two historical analogues worth bringing forward, and I want to be careful about how I use them, because analogues are useful as scale references, but they are not predictions. The first analogue is 1933. In 1933, the Atlantic basin produced the second most active hurricane season on record, before the satellite era began in 1966. 20 named storms in the modern reconstruction, including 5 major hurricanes. The season formed against a backdrop of an El Niño transition and a record-warm Atlantic. The basin's warmth allowed sustained development across the entire season. The El Niño didn't fully kick in until the late season, and by then the basin had already produced most of its activity. 1933 is not the same as 2026. The Atlantic in 2026 is not as warm as the Atlantic in 1933 was. The ENSO transition pacing is different, and the climate baseline is different. But the structural lesson of 1933 is that a hurricane season can be extremely active during an El Niño transition if the basin starts with warm anomalies of its own, and the active half of that season tends to be the early to middle months, before the El Niño shear suppression dominates. I want to spend an extra minute on the 1933 analogue because it is the closest historical match for what 2026's early season setup looks like, and I want you to understand why analogues are dangerous and also why they're useful. In 1933, the equatorial Pacific had just exited a La Niña phase and was transitioning toward weak El Niño conditions during the spring and early summer. The Atlantic basin sea surface temperatures, particularly across the Caribbean and tropical Atlantic, were running anomalously warm, the warmest on record for the basin going back through the available historical reconstructions. The combination of warm Atlantic and ENSO transition produced one of the most active early to middle hurricane seasons in the modern record. 20 named storms formed in the modern reconstruction, with 5 reaching major hurricane intensity, Category 3 or higher on the Saffir-Simpson scale. The first named storm, the 1933 Trinidad hurricane, formed in May and reached hurricane intensity by mid-June. The peak of the season was September and October, with multiple major hurricanes impacting the US mainland and the Caribbean. Now this is a 93-year-old reconstruction, and the data quality is not what we have today. The satellite era doesn't begin until the mid-1960s, and the routine aircraft reconnaissance era doesn't begin until the late 1940s. Some of the storms in the 1933 reconstruction were detected from ship reports and from coastal observations only. The actual peak intensities are uncertain, and the actual track positions are uncertain. So I cite the analogue with appropriate caveats. What the analogue tells you is the structural lesson. A basin with anomalously warm sea surface temperatures, sitting in an ENSO transition window, can produce an extremely active hurricane season, because the local Caribbean and Gulf conditions remain favourable for cyclogenesis, even as the larger-scale ENSO state is changing. Whether 2026 follows that pattern, or whether the ENSO transition happens fast enough to suppress activity by mid-season, is what the model spread covers. The second analogue is 2013. 2013 produced 14 named storms, above the long-term average, despite the development of borderline El Niño conditions during the second half of the season. The activity was heavily weighted toward the early and middle months. The Caribbean and Gulf produced most of the season's tropical storms, and late-season activity in the central and eastern Atlantic was suppressed by the developing El Niño's increased shear. 2013 is the better recent analogue for what 2026 might look like, front-loaded with Caribbean and Gulf systems before shear kicks in. But here's the part that is genuinely unknowable in late May. The forecast spread on the timing and intensity of the 2026 El Niño transition is wide. If the equatorial Pacific warms quickly and reaches +1 degree Celsius or warmer by August, the shear suppression will kick in by mid-season, and the Atlantic basin will see suppressed activity through the peak August-September-October window. If the transition stalls in the neutral to weak El Niño range through the peak months, the Atlantic basin retains its anomalously warm sea surface temperatures without the shear suppression, and the season can produce well above the long-term average. The current model spread on the August peak Oceanic Niño Index covers both scenarios, anywhere from +0.5 to +1.8 degrees Celsius. The actual answer is unknowable in late May. We don't get to know which season we're in until the season tells us. And here's where the moisture surge we have been following becomes the answer to the question. The June 1st through June 10th ensemble window is the season's first read on which scenario is operating. If a named storm forms inside that window, which the ensembles are putting at roughly 10 to 20% probability, that's the front-loaded scenario starting to materialize. If the window passes without development, that doesn't mean the season is suppressed, but it does mean the first read on activity is consistent with the suppression scenario. The next 2 weeks are the first real-world data point we get on which kind of season 2026 is going to be. And whatever happens in that window is happening in the same body of moisture that is breaking the drought right now. The first storm of 2026, if it forms, will form inside the air mass that is delivering the rain across the Gulf Coast and Florida this week. The two are the same atmospheric event. We do not get to separate them. That is what I mean when I say the cure and the threat are the same air mass. The drought relief and the season's first storm are not two events that happen near each other on the calendar. They are two outcomes of the same upper-level configuration, and the country has waited 181 days for the cure, and the cure is arriving on the same air that, 4 days from now, may begin assembling into the threat. The country does not get to choose. The country gets what the atmosphere delivers, and the atmosphere is delivering both. We will come back to this in Part 9, where we work through what the country can afford. But before we get there, I want to take a step back from the moisture surge for one part of the video and look at the configuration that's producing it. Because the moisture surge is not the only thing this upper-level pattern is doing. The pattern is doing several things at once across the entire country, and the things it's doing in other parts of the country tell you something about the pattern's strength and persistence, which tells you something about whether the moisture surge is a one-week event or a setup for the next month. Let's go look at the rest of the map. Part 7. The pattern that locked in. On the same day. There's a phrase I want you to learn because once you have it, you will start to see it everywhere. The phrase is omega block. An omega block is a specific configuration of the jet stream in which the flow takes the shape of the Greek letter omega, a stationary high-pressure ridge in the middle, with two cut-off or quasi-cut-off low-pressure systems flanking it on either side. When you look at a 500 millibar height map and you see an omega block, what you're seeing is a piece of the jet stream that has stopped propagating eastward and has locked into a pattern that can persist for a week or longer. The ridge in the middle anchors warm, dry, stable air over whatever's underneath it. The lows on the sides anchor cool, unsettled weather over whatever's underneath them. Once an omega block sets up, the weather under it doesn't change much until the block breaks down. That breakdown can take 5 days, 10 days, occasionally 2 weeks. On the morning of May 27, 2026, 4 separate National Weather Service offices, Philadelphia, Denver, Chicago, and Los Angeles, independently described the same blocking configuration in their morning area forecast discussions. Philadelphia, in the discussion text for the Mount Holly office that covers New Jersey, eastern Pennsylvania, and Delaware, wrote, quote, "High pressure moves in for the end of the week as an omega block sets up over the central conus. High pressure will remain in control through at least Sunday with dry conditions expected." Close quote. Denver, in the Boulder office that covers eastern Colorado and the Front Range, described a blocking upper-level high over the northern plains. Chicago, in the office that covers northeastern Illinois and northwestern Indiana, described, quote, "an expansive area of surface high pressure setting up across the region, paired with high amplitude ridging extending well into Canada." Close quote. Los Angeles, in the discussion for the Oxnard office that covers Southern California, described the upper low currently spinning over the Sacramento area as producing 555 decameter heights at 500 millibars, called the system unusual for this time of year, and noted that the resulting weather across Southern California would be, quote, "much more like Portland weather than Southern California." Close quote. And then on the warming back end of the block, the Los Angeles office described the heights as rising to 574 decameters by Friday, a, quote, "January-like 560 decameter reading," end quote, in late May. When 4 offices independently name the same blocking pattern on the same day, the pattern is real. The Omega block is set up, and the Omega block is producing 4 simultaneous effects across the country that are all surface signatures of the same upper-level configuration. Effect 1. The cool flip east of the Mississippi River. The east-flanking cut-off low of the Omega block sits over eastern Canada and the northeastern United States. Underneath that low, temperatures are running below normal for the date. Pittsburgh is forecast for a high near 73 degrees Fahrenheit on the 1st of June, Detroit near 75, Orlando, and remember, Orlando is not under the cut-off low, but it's under the influence of the trough-induced cloud cover and rainfall, back into the mid-80s, which is also below normal for late May into early June. The Boston office wrote that temperatures will trend cooler late this week. The New York office wrote that temperatures return closer to normal for the end of this week into early next week. Across the entire northeast and mid-Atlantic, the early days of June are going to feel more like late April than like late May. Not cold, not catastrophic, just cool, relative to the calendar. Effect 2. Record-challenging northern plains heat. The high-pressure ridge in the middle of the Omega block sits over the northern plains and the upper Midwest. Underneath that ridge, the air is subsiding. Subsiding air compresses and compressing air warms. Combined with strong daytime solar heating in late May at high latitudes, where day length is approaching 18 hours, the result is temperatures well above normal. The Weather Prediction Center's morning discussion flagged the northern plains and upper Midwest as facing widespread high temperatures into the 80s and 90s, with some locations across eastern Montana and western North Dakota potentially nearing or eclipsing 100 degrees Fahrenheit. International Falls, Minnesota, on the Canadian border, where the average late May high is in the mid-60s, is forecast to approach 90 degrees by early June. Tucson, Arizona, on the southern end of the warming corridor is forecast for record heat possible on Tuesday, June 2nd. The heat risk forecast, the National Weather Service's experimental product for communicating heat-related health risk, shows widespread moderate to major levels through the end of the week. That is a 120 degree Fahrenheit gradient anomaly in some places. 100 degrees in eastern Montana when the climatological mean late May high in Bismarck is 73 degrees is a plus 25 degree Fahrenheit anomaly. That is anomalous heat in any month, and it is happening during the first week of meteorological summer. Effect 3. The January-like southwest chill. The west-flanking cutoff low of the Omega block sits over central California and the Great Basin, anchored over the Sacramento area at 555 decameters at 500 millibars. Underneath that low, California, Nevada, Utah, and northern Arizona are sitting in a cold air mass that is 15 to 20 degrees below normal in the mountains and far interior, and 3 to 12 degrees below normal along the coasts and in the valleys. San Diego's forecast high is in the 60s, Los Angeles in the 60s, San Francisco in the mid-60s, Las Vegas at 82, Phoenix below normal, Tucson at 93, which sounds warm but is also below normal for late May in the Sonoran Desert. The Los Angeles office wrote that the next 2 days will be much more like Portland weather than Southern California. There is snow forecast in the highest elevations of the Sierra Nevada through midweek. There are gusty winds across the Great Basin and elevated fire weather concerns where the cold air mass is producing low relative humidity, but the precipitation is staying south of the Oregon border. Effect 4, and this is the one that matters most for the moisture surge, is the trough that is digging into the Bay of Campeche and the Western Caribbean. That trough is the eastern wall of the western cutoff low of the Omega block. It is the same atmospheric feature. The trough is the bottom of the U-shape that the upper level low is producing in the jet stream. As that low spins over the Great Basin, the trough extends southward and eastward, reaching into the Bay of Campeche, lifting tropical moisture northward across the Gulf and into the southeast, and providing the upper-level divergence support for the moisture surge we have been talking about for 6 parts of this video. This is the central point of Part 7. Effects 1, 2, 3, and 4 are not 4 separate weather stories about 4 different parts of the country. They are 4 surface signatures of one upper-level configuration: the cool flip east of the Mississippi, the record-challenging northern plains heat, the January-like southwest chill, and the drought-breaking moisture surge from the Caribbean. All of them are the same omega block doing different things in different places at the same time. When the block breaks down, all 4 effects will end together. When the block is locked in, all 4 effects will persist together. The forecast for when the block breaks down is not certain. Several model solutions show the block persisting through the first week of June. Others show a breakdown around June 5th or 6th, as the western cutoff low ejects northeastward into the central United States. The longer the block holds, the longer the moisture surge continues, which means the longer the favourable environment for tropical cyclogenesis in the Western Caribbean and Gulf is in place. The block and the ensemble cyclogenesis window are physically coupled. If the block holds through June 10th, the favourable cyclogenesis environment holds through June 10th. If the block breaks down on June 5th, the favourable environment changes, and the cyclogenesis probability after that point depends on what the next pattern looks like. One more piece of the pattern that I think is worth naming explicitly, because it's the kind of context that you don't get from broadcast weather. The omega block is a member of a class of atmospheric phenomena called atmospheric blocking patterns that have been studied in the climate literature for the better part of a century. The original characterization comes from a paper by Rex in 1950, who identified the pattern in upper air analyses going back to the 1940s. Modern research, including work by Kornhuber and colleagues in 2020 in Nature Climate Change and follow-up work in 2023 in Nature Communications, has examined whether the frequency of these blocking patterns is changing under climate forcing, whether Arctic amplification, which is weakening the temperature gradient between the equator and the pole, is producing a slower, wavier jet stream that locks into blocking configurations more often than it did in the mid-20th century baseline. The literature is genuinely contested. Some studies find a statistically significant increase in blocking frequency over the past several decades. Others find no clear trend, or find that the trend is regional and varies by season. The conservative read on the science is that we are still in the process of figuring out whether the blocking patterns we are seeing are random samples from the long-term climatology, or whether they represent a shift in the underlying distribution. I am not going to tell you that today's omega block is unambiguously a climate-attributable event, because the science doesn't support that stronger claim. What I will tell you is that we have seen multiple high-amplitude blocking patterns this spring on this channel. The May 18th wave amplification event that we covered as the atmosphere-adjusted something nobody alive has ever seen. The May 22nd stalled jet stream event we covered as something is wrong with the jet stream, and it's about to trap the US. And now, the May 27th omega block. 3 high-amplitude blocking patterns in 10 weeks, all of them named explicitly by operational forecasters in their morning discussions, is a high frequency by any climatological standard. Whether that frequency is the random walk of an unforced climate system, or whether it reflects a shifted distribution, the science is still working on that question. But the empirical fact of the high frequency is observable. What I want you to take from this part of the video is the framing. The omega block is the single feature responsible for the entire weather story across the country this week. And the weather story across the country this week and the hurricane season opening 4 days from now are the same story. The pattern that's making your Memorial Day into early June forecast unusual is the same pattern that's setting up the conditions for the season's first named storm. The trough that's drying out the eastern Pacific and the Pacific Northwest is the trough that's pumping moisture into Pensacola. The ridge that's roasting eastern Montana is the ridge that's anchoring the Bermuda High off the southeast coast. Everything is connected through the upper-level configuration. The block is the architecture of the week. And the block is sitting on top of a country that has been baking in drought for 181 days and is now starting to receive the relief, and is 4 days from the official open of hurricane season. The convergence of those 3 calendar facts on the same upper-level configuration is what makes this video worth 20,000 words. It would not be worth this much narration if the drought were not at 131-year record levels. It would not be worth this much narration if the moisture were not at 3 sigma anomaly. It would not be worth this much narration if the hurricane season were not opening in 4 days. The convergence is the story, and underneath the convergence, under the block, under the moisture, under the drought, under the hurricane season clock, the rest of the planet is doing other things. The sun is doing something on the side we can't see. The Chilean subduction zone is letting off pressure. A handful of volcanoes are starting new eruptive sequences. None of that is today's story. But it's worth a quick scan because the Sky Lab covers all of it, and the week the cure for the worst drought in modern record arrives on the same air mass that becomes the hurricane season's first named storm, is also the week the sun does something nobody quite expected, and the Chilean Andes shake themselves loose. That's where we go for part 8, and then we close on part 9 with the question this whole video has been building toward. Part 8. The fire weather backdrop, the sun behind the limb, and the independent layers. The Omega Block Ridge over the northern plains and northern Rockies is not just producing record-challenging heat. It's producing the conditions for the worst fire weather setup the country is going to see this week. The two things are inseparable. The same subsidence that drives the high temperatures also drives the dropping relative humidity. And the same anomalous height anomaly that anchors the ridge also anchors the surface, high-pressure pattern that produces the dry downsloping winds at the surface. The Bismarck National Weather Service Office issued a red flag warning on the morning of May 27th covering Divide, Williams, McKenzie, Golden Valley, Billings, Slope, and Bowman counties in western North Dakota. The warning text describes afternoon temperatures climbing into the lower to mid-90s, relative humidity values dropping as low as 15%, and southeast winds around 25 miles per hour gusting to 40. The red flag warning is in effect today into this evening, and the hazardous weather outlook flags near critical to critical fire weather conditions continuing through Thursday and Friday. The same office expects continued critical fire weather conditions to persist on the backside of the ridge through the end of the week. The Salt Lake City National Weather Service Office issued a second red flag warning covering the Henry Mountains and Grand Staircase fire weather zones, zones 494 and 498 in southern Utah. The text of that warning is more dramatic in technical terms than the Bismarck warning. Relative humidity is forecast to drop as low as 8 to 10% on Wednesday and Thursday afternoons. South winds at 15 to 25 miles per hour, with gusts up to 40 miles per hour, are expected to develop both afternoons. Overnight relative humidity recovery is only expected to reach 25 to 35%. That combination, 8% daytime humidity, 40 mile per hour gusts and only partial overnight recovery, is what the fire weather operational community calls a critical fire weather day, with potentially rapid fire growth conditions if an ignition occurs. These are not isolated warnings. They are two operational expressions of the same upper-level ridge that's producing the northern plains heat. The ridge produces subsidence. The subsidence dries out the boundary layer. The dry boundary layer produces low relative humidity. The pressure gradient around the ridge produces gusty winds. The combination of low humidity, gusty winds, and dry vegetation produces critical fire weather. The same atmospheric feature is producing the heat record threat in International Falls and the 8% humidity threat in southern Utah. They are not two stories. They are one. The fire weather setup matters in the context of this video because of the asymmetry it creates. The eastern half of the country is receiving drought relief. The western half of the country is moving toward elevated to critical fire weather. The drought map and the fire weather map are about to start diverging. They have been the same map for 181 days, and over the next week and a half they are going to separate. The southeast and Gulf Coast move out of fire weather concern as the rain arrives. The Great Basin, the Four Corners, the High Plains, and parts of the northern Rockies stay in or move into elevated fire weather conditions. The same atmospheric pattern that's curing one corner of the country is loading another corner of the country. That asymmetry will define the fire season heading into June, and the operational implications are large. If a fire starts in the Western Corridor over the next 10 days, with humidity values in the single digits and 40 mile per hour gusts, it can grow very quickly. We do not have a fire on the ground in those zones right now. We have the conditions for one. Now let me bring in 2 paragraphs on the other layers of what's happening this week, because they're worth flagging even though they're not the central story. The sun, on the morning of May 27th, is doing something quietly significant. The Space Weather Prediction Center's morning discussion notes that There are 9 numbered regions on the visible disk, and then it gets specific about one that is not yet visible. Quote, Region 4447 remained stable in physical extent with some minor consolidation noted in its trailing spots. Region 4452 continued to show rapid growth in both extent and intermediary region. The remaining regions on the visible disk were relatively simple and were stable or in gradual decay. Close quote. So far, so normal. Then, quote, there is insufficient imagery available to formally analyze this region. However, far-side imagery and heliosismology suggest a somewhat significant region. Close quote. That language, somewhat significant, is unusually direct in SWPC discussions, where the institutional tone is normally careful and qualified. Heliosismology is the technique of measuring acoustic waves propagating through the Sun's interior to infer the location and intensity of magnetic features on the far side of the Sun, the side we cannot see directly from Earth. The technique can detect large sunspot groups before they rotate onto the visible disk. SWPC's phrasing this morning means that, behind the Sun's eastern limb, in territory we can't yet image directly, there is a sunspot group large enough that the acoustic data has flagged it as worth mentioning in the morning discussion. That region will rotate onto the visible disk over the next several days. Combined with multiple occulted flares observed on the northeast limb during the past 24 hours, flares whose source region is hidden behind the limb because the region has not yet rotated into view, and the orphaned faint partial halo CME that appeared in LASCO C2 at 22:30 UTC on May 26th, with no identifiable on-disk source per SWPC's discussion text. The side of the Sun we can't currently see is doing something quietly active. Yesterday's S1 minor proton event, which peaked at 23 PFU at 1:10 UTC on May 26th and has since decayed, was driven by a large far-sided partial halo CME, first seen in GOES 19's coronagraph instrument at 22 UTC on May 25th. That tells us that the active region structure on the far side is real, energetic, and producing eruptive events. As that region rotates around to face Earth over the next 7 to 10 days, the geometry shifts from far-sided to Earth-facing, and the eruptions it produces, if it continues to produce them, would no longer be limb events with limited geomagnetic consequence. They would be direct events with potential geomagnetic and ionospheric impacts on Earth. Today, the visible disk activity is dominated by region 4446, which produced a C9.7 flare at 12:38 UTC on May 26th, the largest of the visible disk activity over the past 24 hours. That region is currently classified as FFCO beta-gamma magnetic structure, with 400 millionths of disk area and 17 sunspots. It has a 15% probability of an M-class flare in the next 24 hours. None of this is the story today, but it's the texture, and the texture matters because the Sun is independent of the Atlantic hurricane season. The Sun is going to do whatever the Sun is going to do on its own clock, on its own physics, while we wait to see whether the Western Caribbean assembles a tropical storm. The seismic and volcanic backdrop is similarly independent. Over the past 24 hours, the Chilean subduction zone, the convergent plate boundary where the Nazca Plate dives beneath the South American plate, produced a cluster of 8 magnitude 4.5 to 5.1 earthquakes along the corridor from Antofagasta through Tarapacá down to Coquimbo. None of them produced a tsunami warning, none of them caused significant damage. But 8 quakes in 24 hours in a single corridor is a notable pulse. The Chilean subduction zone is normally active, but 8 events in one corridor in one day is on the high end of typical. To the west, a magnitude 5.4 event 10 kilometers deep northeast of Neiafu, Tonga, triggered a USGS green alert, the lowest impact category, indicating low probability of significant casualties or damage. A second magnitude 5.4 event in the Tonga region was registered by EMSC at 3.8 kilometers depth, very shallow, in a region known for shallow events along the Tonga-Kermadec Trench. 2 deep focus events in the Fiji region, a magnitude 4.5 at 615 kilometers depth and a magnitude 4.9 at 535 kilometers depth, are routine for that location, but always worth flagging because deep focus earthquakes are physically unusual. On the volcanic side, the Global Volcanism Programme's weekly bulletin and the US Geological Survey's elevated volcano list together show new eruptive activity at Ambay in Vanuatu, at Dukono in Indonesia, at Kikai in Japan, at Taal in the Philippines, and at the submarine Titan Ridge in Papua New Guinea, where an eruption that began on the 8th of May continues in the central Bismarck Sea, continuing eruptive activity at Bazimiani in Kamchatka, at Fuego in Guatemala, at Mayon in the Philippines, at Merapi on Java, and at Kilauea in Hawaii. Kilauea's summit eruption within the Halemaumau crater continued during the past week with episodic fountaining, incandescence, and intermittent spatter. 4 US-monitored volcanoes are at elevated alert. Great Sitkin in the Aleutians on watch orange, the second highest aviation alert level, and Kupreanov, Shishaldin, and Kilauea all on advisory yellow. These are not today's story. The sun's far side, the Chilean cluster, the volcanic activity in the Western Pacific, the seismic background of the planet, all of these are happening on their own timelines, with their own physics, on their own clocks. They are not connected to the upper-level configuration over North America that is delivering the drought relief and setting up the hurricane season window. They are independent layers running in parallel. But I include them because I think it matters to be honest with you about what's happening in the world this week. The Sky Lab covers all of these layers. We have done deep dives on solar far-side detection in the past. We have done deep dives on Pacific Ring of Fire activity in the past. We will do deep dives on these layers again when the data warrants it. Today, the data warrants a brief texturing. The same week the cure for the worst drought in modern record is arriving on the same air mass that becomes the hurricane season's first named storm. The sun is doing something on the side we can't see. The Chilean subduction zone is letting off pressure in an 8-quake cluster, and 5 separate volcanoes around the Pacific Rim are starting new eruptive sequences. The atmosphere is not the only system in motion this week. It is just the one that has organized itself into a single coherent story that we can tell in 19,000 words. Back to the main thread now. We have established the cure, we have established the threat, we have established the configuration that produces both, the social media noise that obscures it, the real ensemble signal that confirms it, the ENSO context that frames it, and the independent layers running underneath it. The video has one part left. The part is the question this whole video has been building toward, the question I want you to sit with after the script ends, the question that I think this audience is uniquely equipped to think about honestly. Can the country afford the cure when the cure carries the threat? Part 9. What the country can afford. Pull up a map of the southeastern United States and the Gulf of Mexico. Mark every reservoir, every aquifer, every river system that has been running below normal for 181 days. Mark every county under a drought response declaration. Mark every winter wheat field rated good to excellent at 30%. Mark every cattle ranch in the 61% of US cattle areas that have been in drought up from 31% year over year. Mark every Florida and Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana community that has been watching the US Drought Monitor map turn deeper red every week since January. That map is the map of who needs the rain. That map is the map of who, by Saturday, will be receiving the first meaningful relief of the year. Now pull up a second map. Mark every coastal county from Brownsville through the Florida Keys around to the Outer Banks. Mark every barrier island community. Mark every flood zone neighborhood, every storm surge zone, every evacuation route, every emergency management facility. That map is the map of who pays the cost if a tropical storm organizes inside the same moisture envelope that's delivering the rain. The two maps overlap, substantially. The Gulf Coast that needs the drought relief is the Gulf Coast that pays the cost of early season cyclogenesis. The Florida that needs the rain is the Florida the storm would hit. The country does not get to receive the cure without receiving the threat. That is the central thread of this video, and we have now reached the part of the video where we have to ask whether the country can afford that. I want to walk through the costs and benefits honestly, because I think honesty matters more than rhetoric on a question like this. The benefits of the moisture surge are substantial. The drought has been on a 131-year record trajectory, the third driest single month of any season on record, sitting behind only the climatological peak of the Dust Bowl. The agricultural sector is exiting the dry phase with the lowest winter wheat good to excellent rating on record, the lowest winter wheat acreage since 1919, and 61% of cattle areas in drought. The arrival of significant rain across the southeastern Gulf Coast in the next 4 days, even if the drought is not ended by it, is unambiguously positive for the food system, for rural communities, for state economies, and for the climatological trajectory of the year. The Florida and Georgia drought response declarations may be relaxable in weeks rather than months if the rain holds. The fire weather risk across the southeastern fire weather zones drops as live fuel moisture rebuilds. The Pearl River and Wolf River and Calcasieu River and Aransas River and Oso Creek and Saluda River systems begin re-establishing baseflow that they have been losing for months. The US Drought Monitor map, when it updates next Thursday, is going to show pockets of improvement in places that have been deepening for half a year. The costs of the moisture surge are also real, and I have not been hiding them from you. The first 3 inches of rain on drought-baked surface-sealed soils produces disproportionate runoff and flash flood response. We are already seeing it in the river gauge data. The Houston Metro, the New Orleans Metro, the Mobile Pensacola Corridor, parts of the Mid-South, and the Ohio Valley are all under flood watch or flood warning as of this morning. The flash flood warnings in Dallas, in Ohio, and in West Virginia have already verified within hours. The rain is arriving in convective bursts of 2 to 3 inches per hour, not in a gentle multi-day soaker, and the surface drainage in much of the southeast is going to back up under that rate. There will be local damage, there will be displaced families, there may be fatalities. None of that is hypothetical. That is the operational forecast for the next 48 to 72 hours. And then there is the storm question. The ensemble window for possible tropical cyclogenesis is June 1st through June 10th. The probability ranges from 6% on the conservative AI model to 20% on the European spectral model. Call it 10 to 15% at the central estimate. That is not high. That is also not zero. At 10 to 15%, the probability is high enough that the National Hurricane Center will be monitoring the area closely starting Friday or Saturday. The probability is high enough that the Air Force Reserve Hurricane Hunters will be on standby for reconnaissance flights starting next week. The probability is high enough that emergency management agencies along the Gulf Coast are running tabletop exercises for a low-end tropical storm landfall scenario this weekend. A 10 to 15% probability of a named storm in the first 8 to 10 days of June is roughly 7 times the climatological base rate for that calendar window. The signal is real. The cost of the threat materializing is on the order of a low-end tropical storm, a few $100 million to a few $1 billion in damage, a few dozen to a few hundred displaced families, a 1-week news cycle. The cost of the threat not materializing is zero in dollar terms, but is also zero in benefit. The moisture surge delivers its rain whether or not it organizes into a storm. Can the country afford the cure? The honest answer is that the country has already accepted the cost because the cost is structural. We have a coastline, we have a hurricane season. We have a Gulf Coast that is geographically situated exactly where early season tropical systems form. The country accepted the cost of that geographic situation when it built cities at New Orleans and Mobile and Pensacola and Tampa and Miami, and put hundreds of billions of dollars of infrastructure in surge-vulnerable zones. The country accepted the cost of the cure when it accepted the position of the country itself on a continent that sits next to a basin that produces tropical storms every year. The question is not whether the country can afford the cure. The question is whether the country is prepared to take the cure the atmosphere is delivering, on the terms the atmosphere is delivering it, in the form the atmosphere is delivering it. I want to walk through the conspiracy-adjacent framings one more time because they are going to be loud in the comment section of this video and across the broader social media ecosystem over the next 2 weeks, and I'd rather address them once, plainly, than have them go unengaged. The first is the drought relief is engineered framing, the claim that the timing of the moisture surge is suspicious, that the cure arriving 4 days before hurricane season opens is too convenient, that some entity, HARP, cloud seeding programs, classified geoengineering operations, must have engineered the rainfall pattern. The factual response is the energy budget argument. Continental scale precipitation patterns are driven by upper-level dynamical processes. Jet stream amplitude, Rossby wave geometry, the Bermuda high position, the Madden-Julian oscillation envelope that operate at energy scales 17 orders of magnitude above any human weather modification capability. The High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program operates at 3.6 megawatts. A single hour of typical Rossby wave-scale circulation processes approximately 10 to the 25th joules of energy. The mismatch is not a small difference. It's 17 orders of magnitude. Cloud seeding can produce a 5 to 15% local enhancement of an already existing precipitating cloud. It cannot manufacture a continental moisture surge from the Caribbean, and even if it could, it would not be doing so in coordination with a documented favourable Madden-Julian oscillation phase and a documented Bermuda high position. The drought break is happening because the atmosphere is doing what it does. There is no engineering capable of producing it on the scale we are observing. The second framing is the Hurricane Center is hiding the real forecast claim. The implication that the National Hurricane Center's no formation expected in the next 7 days outlook is a cover for an actual forecast that's much more alarming. The factual response is that the NHC outlook process is the most transparent forecasting operation in any branch of the US government. The products are public. The discussion text is signed by named on-shift forecasters, Berg and Reinhardt this morning, Brown and Brennan and Cangialosi on other shifts. The underlying data, the sea surface temperature analyses, the European ensemble fields, the GFS fields, the wind shear analyses, the Madden-Julian oscillation diagnostics, are independently available from non-NHC sources. Anyone with an internet connection can verify NHC's call by looking at the underlying data directly. The independent convergence of 3 different ensemble systems on a low probability June 1st through 10th signal is itself the verification. That signal is what the discussion text describes, accurately as low probability development possible later in the window. The NHC is not hiding anything. It is communicating accurately. The hype channels are misrepresenting what accurate communication looks like, because accurate communication doesn't generate clicks. The third framing is the ensembles are wrong on purpose claim. The implication that the European Centre, the US, National Weather Service and Google DeepMind are coordinating to suppress or inflate the forecast for whatever reason the framing requires. The factual response is structural. These are 3 independent organisations in 2 countries with 3 fundamentally different institutional incentive structures and 3 completely different mathematical architectures. Coordinated falsification across the European Centre for medium-range weather forecasts, the US National Centres for Environmental Prediction, and Google DeepMind's weather group would require a level of cross-institutional, cross-architectural coordination that has no historical precedent and no plausible mechanism. The simpler explanation is the correct one. 3 independent systems are picking up a real low probability signal in the same calendar window because the underlying atmospheric environment supports that signal across the range of methodological approaches. The fourth framing, the drought, fire, heat and hurricane sequence is a Great Reset scarcity event, deserves direct engagement because it has appeared in the comment sections of multiple recent videos. The underlying conditions are real. Record drought, record agricultural stress, record fire weather setups, record temperature anomalies, ENSO transition, 3 sigma moisture anomalies. All of these are observable. None of them are manufactured. The framing error is in the causal attribution. The conditions are not the product of a coordinated scarcity engineering campaign. They are the product of documented Rossby wave amplification under a documented 1300-year mega-drought baseline, with the Hansen aerosol unmasking hypothesis as a credible but contested amplification mechanism. The convergence is not a plan. It is the kind of convergence the climate science literature has been forecasting for 20 years. The honest response to viewers who feel that something is being done to them is that the climate system is doing it, that the system is doing it because of cumulative greenhouse gas forcing combined with the EMO 2020 maritime fuel sulfur cap, and that the engineering question is not how to stop the climate system, but how to adapt to its outputs. And the fifth framing, El Niño will fix everything, deserves engagement on the opposite side because it shows up as a hopeful narrative in some corners. El Niño signal lags. The Pacific does not flip and immediately refill the western reservoirs or end the southeast drought. Spring predictability barriers apply to the strength and timing of any forecast El Niño. The relief, if it materializes, typically arrives in late autumn or winter, and even then is concentrated in atmospheric river precipitation over California, beneficial Gulf and Texas rain, and a wetter southern tier. The southeast, Florida, and Georgia are not guaranteed relief from El Niño's standard teleconnection pattern. Drought relief during the spring and summer of 2026 depends primarily on the kind of tropical activity that the early June ensemble window is sniffing, not on any far future El Niño teleconnection. And that brings me to the social media hype cycle one more time, because I want to close on it, and then we land the video. The hype channels that have been running Arthur thumbnails since Monday are not just wrong about the timing, they are wrong about what hurricane forecasting is for. Hurricane forecasting is for making real decisions in the face of low probability, high consequence events. It is for emergency managers deciding whether to pre-position generators. It is for state agriculture departments deciding whether to authorize early harvest. It is for coastal county sheriff's departments deciding whether to update evacuation routes. It is for the residents of low-lying coastal areas deciding whether to put their boat in the yard. Real hurricane forecasting tells you what the actual probability of impact is, when the next decision point is, and what the consequence is if the probability resolves the wrong way. Real hurricane forecasting trades on its credibility. The hype channels burn that credibility for clicks. They produce week after week breathless content about systems that never form, until the audience either becomes desensitized to legitimate warnings or becomes permanently anxious about events that don't happen. Either outcome is bad for the people who actually depend on accurate forecasts when an actual storm shows up. The real Arthur, if it forms, will form in the first week of June, inside the moisture envelope we have been following for 9 parts of this video. It will probably be a low-end tropical storm. It will probably make landfall somewhere on the Gulf Coast or in Florida. It will probably deliver drought-busting rain to a region that needs the rain. It will probably dissipate within 4 days of formation. It will probably make the front of the local newscasts in Tampa and Pensacola for 4 nights, and then disappear from the national conversation. And the question of whether 2026 is a front-loaded season or a suppressed throughout season will still be unresolved when it dissipates, because one named storm does not answer the question. The question will be answered by what does or doesn't happen in July and August and September, as the El Niño transition either accelerates or stalls, and the Atlantic basin either compounds its early season activity or suppresses under increasing shear. What we know today, on May 27, 2026, is the part we know. The drought is breaking. The atmosphere is delivering the relief. The relief is arriving on the same air mass that the world's major weather models are watching for tropical development. The cure and the threat are the same air mass. The country does not get to receive one without the other. The hype channels are wrong about the timing, the meaning, and the magnitude of what's about to happen, and the audience is going to have to be its own filter for the next week and a half as the noise continues to compound. The Sky Lab will be your filter. We will tell you when the signal becomes the story. The next time we sit down together to talk about this, the hurricane season will have opened. There may or may not be a storm in the Western Caribbean. There may or may not be a name on it. The Omega Block may or may not still be locked in. The Northern Plains may or may not still be sitting at 100 degrees Fahrenheit in early June. The Sun's far side region may or may not have rotated onto the visible disk and begun producing direct event eruptions. The Chilean subduction zone may or may not have produced another magnitude 5 cluster. The food system, the water system, the fire system, the climate system, all of them are running on their own clocks, and we will be here for whichever clock chimes first. But for today, the story is this. The worst drought in modern record is starting to break. The first real moisture of the year is arriving across the southeast and the Gulf. The hurricane season opens in 4 days. 3 independent ensemble systems are converging on a low probability signal for tropical development inside the same air mass that's breaking the drought. The cure and the threat are the same body of moisture, and the country has been waiting 181 days for this rain, and the rain is here, and what comes with it is what comes with it. What's replacing the drought is worse, not because the rain is worse than the drought, but because the atmospheric machinery that's delivering the rain is the same machinery that opens the next chapter, and the next chapter is the hurricane season, and the hurricane season opens on top of an ENSO transition that nobody can fully predict, and the country that has been waiting for the rain is the country that has to live with what comes next. That's what we know. That's what the data says. That's what the models say. That's what the National Hurricane Center says when it says formation is not expected in the next 7 days. And that's what the European Centre and the GFS and Google DeepMind say when they say possible development is on the table for June 1st through June 10th. That's where we are. Stay with us. The next chapter starts in 4 days.